Hello, Rod Peppiatt from the Avenue Uniting Church in Blackburn, Victoria, meeting on Wurundjeri country. Today brings us into the last week before Christmas. Just a little accompaniment from Blackburn Road there. My reflection is called Before They Were Saints, and it focuses on Matthew's story of the birth of Jesus told in chapter 1 of his Gospel. And he says these words: "Now the birth of Jesus the Messiah took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, 'Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus. He will save his people from their sins.' Now all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. In these words, 'Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel,' which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus." Sometimes the stories of Mary and Joseph actually make me quite sad. I think I've told before of how the moment that God really made sense to me was when I held our baby son for the first time, just on 31 years ago. In those moments, I just gazed at him, almost trance-like, while the midwife helped my wife through the post-birth processes. Looking at him, I sensed the sacredness of life in a way and with an intensity that I don't think I had ever done before. They hadn't cleaned him up yet. They'd just given Catherine a hold. They'd done the tests. They'd wrapped him up and given him to me. And I knew as I looked at him and as I held him tight that in our physical union of love and delight, Catherine and I had entered into the creativity and love of life in a wonderful way. Not simply for the purpose of procreation, but because we enjoyed it. Sex is good. There you go, I've said it. When it's consensual, mutual, respectful and loving, sex is good. And that's why sometimes the stories of Mary and Joseph make me quite sad, because the traditions and the stories that we have inherited have taken something from them, which has been a wonderful part of my life and my marriage. So I feel sad for them. More than that, the traditions around Jesus' conception say, I think, something pretty strange about God. They say that the Holy Spirit of life, the ground of all being, has a problem with the sexuality that has been part of all life from the beginning. Now, clearly in all of this, I'm referring to one tiny little word in the reading from Matthew's Gospel: virgin. I'll talk about that further in a minute. But it's not just that one little word. There's a whole lot more to it. Whole traditions and doctrines, not to mention theological bun fights, have arisen around the sexuality of Joseph and Mary, and indeed Mary's mother for that matter. The early centuries of the church were preoccupied with whether Jesus was God or human, and how he could save us if he was just human. And with Augustine, several hundred years after Jesus, we found the strange notion of original sin coming into being. The idea that Eve's sin of eating the apple back there in the Eden myth was passed from generation to generation through the act of sex. Friends, I believe that original sin is a sick distortion of the biblical stories and teachings, including those of Paul, and more about Augustine trying to deal with his own sexuality than anything else. How anyone can look at a newborn child and imagine it to be born in sin is beyond me. But back to Mary and Joseph. In Matthew's Gospel, back to before they were saints. According to Matthew, when Joseph finds out Mary is pregnant, he's troubled. In human terms, there are two possibilities, aren't there? They've had sex before marriage, or Mary has had sex with someone else. Either of these would be enough for Joseph to be troubled. Both were culturally very problematic. The purity or the virginity of women was regarded with huge, almost vigilance. It was regarded as something to be prized. It was regarded as a person, particularly a woman, well, obviously a woman, was less than human if she was not virginal when married. But after some thought and the assurance from the angel, says Matthew, Joseph decides to marry her. Now that's the human layer. When we add another layer to it, the faith layer, it becomes even more complex. In the decades after Jesus' life and death, as his followers reflect and tell their stories of him, they begin to see him as not simply acting on behalf of God, but as God himself, somehow in human form. And how this could be so occupied the church for centuries. But quite early on, the stories around Jesus began to be recast as befitting the origins of a Holy One among us. Our earliest source of New Testament writings is Paul. He's either unaware of or uninterested in the whole virgin discussion. And then Mark's Gospel doesn't mention Jesus' origins at all. But by the time of Matthew, probably 40, 50, 60 years after Jesus, it seems that the idea of Mary as a virgin is beginning to emerge. Although in Matthew's Gospel, the passage that I just read, the word that he uses in verse 23, parthenos, actually translates as unmarried woman rather than person who has not had sex. Now culturally, that assumed virginity in a woman. And it seems pretty clear that that's Matthew's assumption. And we can gauge that by the fact that in the prophecy that he draws on from Isaiah chapter 7, the Hebrew word used simply translates as young woman. The Hebrew is almah, feminine equivalent of elem, which is young man. Then we go forward from Isaiah several centuries to Matthew, and we can see that not only has the ancient prophecy been claimed for Jesus, but the anointed one of God is increasingly becoming seen as God in himself. And like many other divine narratives of his day, Matthew sees and draws together the story of a virgin birth as part of this narrative. There are quite a lot of such stories in the ancient writings we have. So read in its world, the drama does not end with divorce, but with a divine intervention. God created the pregnancy, says Matthew. And in the wonder at what Jesus became, Matthew's community merges memories of divine interventions in the Old Testament to enable sterile women to become pregnant, Hannah and others, and it merges those with popular stories of miraculous pregnancies. For Matthew, this is about offering another explanation of how Jesus, born of Mary, could become who he became, and to do so without slurring Mary's name in the process. And just like the genealogy which precedes it, this is an important symbolic story, including for those of us who do not accept its physical accuracy or biblical literacy. I'm aware that some people who don't believe in the virgin birth as a physical or literal reality wonder why we read this story in church. For others, this is no issue at all, apart from hearing other people say they don't believe in it. We, like all Christian communities, hold a variety of convictions, and that's a good thing. I honour that. It's one of the things I love about church. I don't understand the virgin birth as a literal reality, or that it's the only understanding supported by the text. But I have no difficulty in honouring the fact that it's in Matthew's story, because it's how he came to see Jesus as divine. I respect people who come to a different conclusion from mine. For a long time, I felt I needed to avoid it and tried to get out of having the Matthew reading read. I no longer feel I need to avoid it. And in fact, today I speak of it for two reasons in particular. Firstly, if Jesus was one of us, as I believe, then he shares our origins. And that, for me, doesn't negate the role of the Holy Spirit in his conception and birth. Where love is, there is God. And, if I'm honest, I really like the idea of Mary and Joseph, before they were saints, back then when they were ordinary people, holding their child as I held ours, and seeing the sacredness of life in him, as I did in our son and our daughter when she came along. And secondly, if I'm able to say anything meaningful of God, it's this. Whatever God is in relationship of compassion, grace, love, and wholeness. If we are to see Jesus' story as Emmanuel, God with us, then I think it includes an embracing of human reality. All of it. And for me, this year, that means remembering Mary and Joseph as they were before they were saints. In the name of the Holy One in whom we live and move and have our being. Amen. Shalom.